Genres. Genres are a rather strange animal. On the one hand, they're an incredibly useful tool for expanding conversation and relaying information extremely quickly. On the other hand, there's a rather big problem with genres being used as a way to exclude people and subjects from the very same conversations. They can easily be used for elitism and mockery. They're an indispensable tool, but one that I definitely think has gotten out of hand in recent years. Not a month goes by without me hearing about yet another new genre in music that might not really need to exist. Nightcore, sludge step, death grind, wonky, gent step, it's absolutely ludicrous. Games, meanwhile, constantly have arguments breaking out where people fight over whether so-and-so game is a real RPG, or a true Dark Souls game, or whatever nonsense. It's completely okay to debate whether a piece of work fits into a genre. If it doesn't, then you're not relaying the proper information by claiming it does. But it's important to not rely on the no true Scotsman fallacy to reach these conclusions. There has to be actual tangible differences between the work in question and the genre it's supposedly being forced into. These genre wars have become a huge problem, I think. Now, why would this be? Why would people care so much about placing games or music into the quote-unquote correct genres? I think it's because people treat genres more like exclusive clubs today. They use genres to dismiss information and arguments that they may not agree with, rather than to do the opposite and actually inform people. Genres have become status symbols, and it has set a rather unhealthy precedent for how we conduct ourselves in conversation. Back to music for a second. I myself am really big into metal. I grew up listening to bands like Queensryche, Iron Maiden, Metallica, etc. because that's what my parents listened to, and I've been following the genre since then as it's changed and expanded. Metal has a huge issue with over-genreification. Practically every new band needs a new genre, or so people seem to believe. A lot of these genres make sense. Industrial metal is way different from death metal, which is worlds away from power metal. But do we really need genres like death and roll? Do we really need to differentiate between things like medieval metal, Viking metal, and pirate metal? Can't they just be wrapped into a single genre called theme metal or something? What really is the difference between unblack metal, Christian metal, and white metal? In fact, why is lyrical theme by itself a differentiating factor? Should we start separating all songs by lyrical theme? Well, the third song on so-and-so's new album is definitely love metal, which I can't stand. But the fourth song completely fits into the political metal category, and that's much more my style. What about all of the core genres like metalcore, grindcore, deathcore, sludgecore, and so on? Why is gent literally named after the sound of a palm-muted guitar when nearly every other genre of metal relies on this technique? Nintendo metal? Electronicore? Really? And though it's not relegated to just metal, don't even get me started on nightcore. Oh, definitely don't get me started on that sad excuse for a new musical genre. Keep in mind, I'm not at all saying there's anything wrong with the music itself in these genres, but the way they're classifying it is a problem because it's confusing, inconsistent, and ends up doing the exact opposite of what a genre is intended to do. Except nightcore. I am saying there's something wrong with nightcore. It's plagiarism, and it's lazy as hell. My point is, it's gotten way out of hand. Do we need to call it something like symphonicore just because someone uses symphonic metal techniques in metalcore? People spend hours arguing over what fits into what genre because they're being created so haphazardly that nobody actually knows where the lines in the sand are that dictate a change in genre. Games are lucky enough to not really have too big of a problem with this. We have strange genres like walking simulator, roguelike, and Metroidvania. Even still, those genres are vastly different in structure from others, and have pretty clear boundaries. They deserve to be separated into a new genre. We've also gotten some rather vague and pointless genres like action. What even is an action game compared to a hack and slash or a beat 'em up? But overall, we've not gotten too out of hand with our genre naming conventions in games. No, the similarities between the genre problems with games and the genre problems with metal is really in how people use these definitions. If you're into racing games, how many times have you heard someone say, "That's not a real sim racer though"? Or how many times have you been berated for playing a casual shooter that isn't anywhere near as complex or cool as the shooters someone else plays? People will spend time deciding what's more important to a genre, regardless of if it's based in fact or not. Let's use RPGs as an example, since it's one of the places in games where this happens most often. People argue all the time whether an RPG needs to be more about story or more about gameplay. You're probably deciding that for yourself right now. I can't help but ask why it has to be one or the other. I think discussions like this are a rather large problem the gaming industry is facing right now, because they lack balance. These types of discussions are always so black and white, but if we stop defending points and actually think about it for a second, we'll realize that both narrative and gameplay are imperative in an RPG. If story was the only vital part, then movies would all be role-playing games. But gameplay alone can't suffice either, because without a story, you have no role to play. You have to have both. How you balance it is what matters. That's why Western and Japanese RPGs are traditionally so different, because WRPGs focus on letting your gameplay choices dictate the story, and JRPGs have the story dictating the gameplay. Story and gameplay are still both vital parts of the formula, and how you use them all depends on what kind of experience you want to make for the player. It doesn't always have to be a definitive one or the other proposition. It's about understanding how both pieces can complement each other, not which is more important. The vast majority of people aren't dumb enough to truly believe one is universally better for the genre than the other, as a whole, but that sort of argument still breaks out all the time. Sometimes people explode in scathing hatred for others who disagree with their point of view, or they mock people who like something they see as casual or not a true insert subject here. In reality, it just comes down to building different experiences for different people. Some people want RPGs that focus more on gameplay, and others want them to focus more on story. Some also want a happy medium. No design philosophy is wrong, they're just targeting different audiences by creating different experiences. The experiences you like aren't necessarily the right ones. They can all coexist without one being better than the other. As for problems with the actual definition of the genre RPG, if we're thinking in a vacuum, then basically any video game is an RPG. A role-playing game by definition is simply an interactive experience, usually for entertainment purposes, where the player assumes the role of someone other than themselves. The only reason video games we classify as RPGs are classified as such is because they were the closest/first digital analogs to the then popular tabletop RPGs. But tabletop RPGs weren't the first form of roleplay, and therefore are not the be-all end-all for classification when it comes to roleplay. Their influence alone shouldn't dictate what else is and isn't in the same category, especially because implying that the characteristics that make up a genre can't change or grow over time is short-sighted and hypocritical. By that logic, practically no RPG after 1990 would really be an RPG anymore, because they had already changed a lot by then. If one wants to step out of that vacuum and get technical and realistic about the definition, an RPG video game would be classified by one of a handful of groups of rules and design philosophies that make up the game in question. WRPGs are different from JRPGs, which are different from CRPGs, etc. In general, they all do indeed attempt to interpret the rules of tabletop RPGs, and they do it in their own ways, with WRPGs emphasizing the role of the player, JRPGs emphasizing the role of the DM/GM, and CRPGs emphasizing the rules and systems that make the game up. But with all that being said, the important thing to remind ourselves of is all genres expand over time to include more elements. Metal music today is nothing like metal was in the 70s, and horror movies from the 60s are extremely different from the modern analog. But they still all fit within their genres. We still call Black Sabbath metal and The Birds a horror movie. So even though elitists will say things like, so-and-so game isn't a real RPG, they refuse to realize that the definition is, and forever will be, changing. It will always be expanding to include more design choices. I've heard a lot of people say things like, the Souls games aren't actually RPGs because you have too much control over your character and it's not reliant enough upon stats. But if you think about it, they're very much Western RPGs, even though the emphasis is on actual character control. The turn-based, strategic, slow implementation of RPG mechanics in video games actually has little to do with the tabletop games they're originally based off of. In reality, stats in most tabletop games can mean very little, because it's ultimately up to the DM in the end to decide how things happen. If he or she doesn't want your character to die, they'll find a way to make them live. Encounters in a tabletop game can go as fast or as slow as the DM lets them. They're only superficially turn-based. There is no control in a tabletop game either to compare to video games, so making the game slow and turn-based is only a single interpretation of the tabletop rules. In fact, when one plays a tabletop game, you don't imagine your characters taking turns, you imagine something much more natural and kinetic, like a scene in a movie. So why would a more natural and kinetic interpretation somehow be wrong in a video game? Why would that not fit into the RPG category? Again, it's just a different interpretation. It's doing nothing more than changing which parts of the tabletop RPGs get the most focus when translated into a digital medium. And again, you don't even need to base it off of tabletop RPGs technically. That's just what we're used to. I think the point is that genres were created as a shorthand for conversation. They're an easy way to communicate whole ideas to people with single words or phrases. They were intended to make conversation easier and more efficient, so using them for elitism is rather silly and shows a distinct lack of knowledge and respect for the subject at hand, not to mention just general egoism. Whether something does or doesn't fit into the confines of a genre should be a purely academic decision based on whether it fits in the current criteria of the genre and where that genre seems to be heading. Not only do RPG video games not have to forever adhere strictly to the mechanics of tabletop RPGs, which have changed drastically themselves over the last 30 years, mind you, but they can also forge their own path and create their own design philosophies that later generations in later mediums can be based on. So can metal. Genres are intended to make classification and discussion easier, not to dictate what things are and aren't worthy of a moniker, or who can be in your special club.